We are so thrilled to have a special event for you today, which we are combining with a very important class happening on campus. And we are really grateful that despite the fact that we would much rather be with all of you in person and also sharing Med-Deli, we are really grateful for the technology that allows us to bring folks in from Europe, and we've done that quite a bit this week, and we're really grateful that Zoom at least allows us that. So thanks for joining us. Also, I want to make a note, some folks have been emailing. All of our events this week have been filmed, and today's is also being recorded. So if you want to watch it again, or if you've missed one and you'd like to watch it, please, or your friends are dying to see it, please refer to our YouTube channel. It takes a couple days to get it up there, downloaded and re-uploaded, but it'll be there. So feel free to pass the word on about that. I have the great opportunity to introduce Professor Konrad Jarosz, who is well known amongst the European Studies majors as the man who teaches history 159 and wrote the book about it. And it's wonderful to hear how many students enjoy that class so much. It's one of our core courses for the European Studies major, and Konrad Jarosz has been teaching that class a long time. And I like to say that you know, it might be a 100 level class, but nobody treats it that way. So we're so grateful that, Konrad, you are still so much a part of our center. You are one of our co-founders of the center in 1993, and you are still so active in all the work that we do, and we're so grateful for it. You have written over 40 books, and this event today is in conjunction with your latest book, forthcoming, Embattled Europe, right? Embattled Europe, a progressive alternative. And we're going to hear a little bit more about that today, but also about the transatlantic relationship and the struggles that Europe has been facing over the past decade. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Professor Konrad Jarosz. Please go ahead and put your questions in the chat. I'll be helping to moderate that piece later on. And thank you again for coming.
Well, thank you very much for a kind introduction. And Kathleen Shanahan-Lindner is the heart of the Center for European Studies. And therefore, we all have to be grateful for her own transatlantic engagement. Welcome to the lecture by Professor Hartmut Kaelble, transatlantically from Berlin. It's already evening there, but he can handle this well. Let me just justify the topic in a couple of sentences and then say something about his expertise in the area. In 1990, it looked like everything was going well in Europe. Communism was overthrown. There was a chance of democratization and prosperity and market development in the new East European post-Soviet countries. And then there was also both further deepening and widening of the European Union in the decade thereafter. And this all seemed to be going very well. And then in the 2000s, you have suddenly a series of really vicious crises that stopped the process of integration, threatened the survival of the European Union, and also triggered a whole bunch of really critical appraisals with Boris Johnson in Britain, and then, you know, President Trump in the United States. The conservative part of politics was engaging in what some of us called Euro trashing, that is, telling that Europe was going to go to the dogs. Brexit was there even before Brexit, and so on and so forth. And the question then became, would Europe be able to survive these crises? And of course, it's still there. And with the election of President Biden, there is a new chance at transatlantic engagement and transatlantic dialogue. And it is for these reasons that I explain a little bit more in detail in my forthcoming book on Embattled Europe that we asked Professor Hartmut Kaelble to come and visit with us, because he's simply the leading historian of 20th century Europe in Germany. And since Germany is a crucial part of the European Union, this seemed like a good choice. We both go back over 50 years. I don't know if you remember us meeting in East Germany when communism was very much alive and well, and we were both working in an East German archive. And since you never quite knew whether somebody was put on you by the Stasi, it was great fun to see somebody, a colleague from the West, who was working on a topic, namely entrepreneurs, first in the empire, then in Berlin, and so on. He has been a central figure at the Free University in its European studies, and at the Humboldt University more recently in Berlin. He has written widely on inequality, on comparative methods, and on European topics, European social history, in a variety of ways, edited volumes, and so on and so forth. And therefore, he has been recognized, especially by the French government, with an honorary Ph.D., which is not something that every academic, an honor that every academic achieves. And all at the same time, he has been teaching generations of German students, including Katie Lindner, which is another one of the connections and ironies of today's lecture. So we feel both, we are both admiring his intellectual capacity and the amount and insight in his academic works, and we appreciate him as a colleague and friend. Hartmut, welcome to Chapel Hill electronically, and we're looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you very much, Konrad. Thank you very much for your very kind introduction, and also for the invitation, which was real some times ago, which is now virtual. And I'm happy not to meet you again in the hotel in Dessau, where we met in 1967, but now at least virtually, but in a totally different world. Now, Konrad asked me to talk about the role of Germany in the European Union in the 2010s. This role of Germany in Europe is an old question. More than 60 years ago, in the 1950s, a leading German historian, Ludwig the Hero, gave a skeptical answer to this question, which is often cited. In his view, Germany is too small to become a hegemonial power in Europe, as the disastrous attempts in the First and Second World War showed. But Germany was attempted to try as soon as the balance between the larger European countries in Europe declined. The hero described in this book, which you see here, described a dangerous pitfall at the beginning of the two world wars, this is my question, what is the answer to this question under the new circumstances of the early 21st century? Does the pitfall continue when the balance between the large member states of the European Union was upset? Konrad asked me to talk about a period which historians usually do not cover, the period of crisis in Europe between 2009 and 2020. Historians discussed intensively the difficult 1970s, a debate in which Konrad participated. Historians start to discuss the happy 1990s, which Konrad just mentioned. The decade of the crisis of the European Union since 2009 is an untouched, almost untouched topic for historians, but the backlog of this lecture. Therefore, I shall first attempt to call back into your mind the main characteristics of the European 2010s, which is not easy because we do not have the distance which historians need, also because this period was very different in Europe, different from the United States. Thereafter, as a second part of the lecture, I present the different interpretation of Germany's role in the European Union during the 2010s. And in a third part, I shall briefly look at the role of Germany in each of the 6 crises of the European Union in the 1910s. And in the conclusion, I shall summarize my argument, which I am happy to discuss with you. Now, the first part, the context, the backlog, the dark period between 2009 and 2020. This period was particularly difficult for the history of European integration for 4 reasons. This period was first seen by many observers as the most difficult decade since the beginnings of the European integration, because never before such an accumulation of crises occurred. The financial crisis between 2009 to 2012, then the Ukraine crisis since 2014, still going on, the Greek indebtedness crisis in 2015, the refugee crisis in 2015, 2016, the Brexit crisis 2016 to 2020, hopefully until 2020, not longer. And finally, the Corona crisis in 2020, which is still going on, hopefully stopping at the end of this year, we hope. I do not share the view that this is the most severe accumulation of crises in the history of the European Union. Since in the 1970s, the European community had to face a similar compilation of crises. At any rate, the 2010s were and still are a highly difficult period with the most drastic collapses of economic growth since the Second World War. In 2008, 2009, also in the United States, in 2012 to 2013, in 2020 until now, also in the US. The character of the 6 crises which I mentioned varied strongly, but all these crises were difficult new challenges for the European Union. All these crises had the potential of dividing, Konrad mentioned this, dividing the European Union, since they did not hit each member in the same way, a major challenge. All these crises were particularly European, except of the beginnings of the financial crisis and except of the COVID-19 crisis. Some experts believed, and Konrad mentioned this, that the European Union was overburdened by these crises and was to fall apart. Other experts, and I'm joining them, other experts believe that European leaders adapted to these crisis models and that some of these crises were even productive shocks for the European Union. Germany was hit and challenged by all these crises. Some observers believe that Germany was even the winner of these crises, since her position was to be stronger in 2020 than in 2008. In economic terms, at least, however, there is no evidence for this assumption. The share of the German GNP in relation to the GNP of the European Union was almost the same in 2020 and in 2008. The same is true for the average yearly income of Germans in relation to the average income in the European Union. The controversial German exports even increased less strongly than the average of all other member states, especially because of the rise of the exports of the new Eastern member states. To be sure that Southern European member states were hit more severely by these crises than the Northern and Eastern member states in the early 2010s. I think this is what everybody knows. But this dividing line between North and South was reduced in the second half of the 2010s. In the actual COVID-19 crisis, the major dividing line was and is between West and East of the European Union. Perhaps we come back to this in the discussion. Now, the second characteristic of the 2010s for the European Union is the economic, technological, demographic, and military decline of the Union in global terms, even before Britain left the European Union. The decline was especially strong for economic growth. The GDP of the European Union, according to the World Bank, fell from 25% of the global GDP in 2008 to 19% in 2019. In contrast to the United States, whose share increased from 23 to 24%. That means that the share of Europe was larger than the US share in 2008, but clearly smaller in 2019. The decline was also strong for innovation. If we take patents as an indicator for innovation, the share of the patents of the European Union in the global patents fell from 9% in 2008 to 4% in 2019, remaining on a far lower level and falling more rapidly than in the United States. This European decline was less strong or even lacking in trade, in population, in military expenditure, but on the whole, the crucial economic growth and innovation of the European Union weakened distinctly, in contrast to the United States. An intensive debate about this decline of the European Union did not take place in Europe, apart from a growing uneasiness about the rise of China. But the rhetoric of the European Union adapted to this situation. The new political goal of having a voice of Europe in the world emerged. The defensive term of the sovereignty of the European Union, which was invented by the French President Macron, makes this even more clear. In his view, Sovereignty of the European Union means protection of the external borders, protection against external dumping, protection for the European standard of environment and social regulations, protection for the European data protection and encouragement of European startups in digitalization. This language of resilience is very different from global Britain, the language of the actual British government. The third characteristic of the 1910s European Union, the decline of the support and enthusiasm for regional integration, especially among the global powers. The Putin government in Russia did not take seriously the European Union because it did not fit into the Russian concept of sovereignty, in which the government would never transfer power to an international body. China, which gave up totally the idea of regional integration in East Asia, also only very hesitantly acknowledged the European Union as a counterpart and preferred to influence individual member states. And an important political leaning in the United States saw the European Union not as an ally, but as a rival, a view which became dominant in the American foreign policy during the Trump administration. In other words, European Union, European integration was surrounded by skepticism, rejection, or even hostility in the 2010s, in contrast to the second half of the 20th century, when regional integration was appreciated and established in the Near East, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, in North America, and when the East Asian community was planned, and when the Russian leader Gorbachev spoke of a common European house, whatever this meant. A fourth characteristic of the 2010s were the strong internal threats. Among them, the political disarray of the balance between the large member states of the European Union. Britain decided to leave the European Union in 2016 and was a disengaged member state even before, during the Cameron government. France went through a period of weak presidents, Sarkozy and Hollande, until 2016, the election of President Macron. Italy was in severe economic difficulties and became again an influential member state only since 2014 with the Renzi government, or one could also say only in 2016 with the Gentiloni government, and recently with the strong Draghi government. Spain also suffered from severe economic difficulties and for some years also was confronted with the rigid policy recommendation by the European Union. And Poland chose a sort of self-isolation in the European Union. In this situation, a new, unwillingly strong position of Germany emerged, which lived through a period of unusual continuity of government with Angela Merkel. For these reasons, in a way, we are dealing with a sort of German years in the European Union until 2016. A further important, besides this disarray between leading members, a further important internal threat for the European Union was the anti-European populism, which increased in the 2010s in national parliaments and in the European parliaments, and even got into power in some member states. A further political threat, the attacks by Islamistic terrorists in various member states, was not simply external. Some terrorists were European. On the whole, the 1910s were a difficult and challenging decade, clearly different from the former history of European integration. It was perhaps a German decade, but also the clear contrast of a golden era of the European Union. But how observers and social scientists see the role of Germany in this period? Do they see again a sort of Tehio trap, a new German attempt of hegemony because of the lacking balance between the large member states of the European Union? Now I come to my second part, the different views of Germany's role in Europe during the 2010s. There is no consensus, you may say always, there is no consensus about the role of Germany in the European Union in the 2010s, but also no distinct controversy. There are four views with many variations. First, the reluctant German hegemon. Secondly, the mediating German hegemon. Thirdly, the powerful and dangerous German hegemon. And fourthly, the German co-leadership in the European Union. I shall present each view in some details. I should add that Germany's role is not an omnipresent theme in recent books on the European Union. In a substantial number of books, the topic is not discussed or even not mentioned at all. The first view of Germany as a reluctant hegemon in Europe with the leadership avoidance complex, I'm citing Simon Balmer and William Patterson, of a paralyzing vacuum in the center of the continent, I'm citing Brendan Sims from this book, can be found mainly among Anglo-Saxon political scientists and historians. In this view, Germany should be the hegemon or the leading country in Europe, but it cannot take over the role. And I present now the arguments by Balmer and Patterson, partly because the other large member states do not accept it, partly because of a strong domestic pressure against the stronger financial engagement of Germany, against military missions and higher military expenditure, partly also because the political decision-making in Germany is too fragmented for leadership in Europe. The second contrasting view fully accepts Germany as a hegemon, but tries to bring it in line with the past. This position can be found among European and American academics and politicians. German hegemony in Europe is not, in this view, is not avoided or refused, but accepted. We are the hegemon is the title of an article by Herfried Münkler, a German social scientist and specialist of modern wars. Münkler sees Germany as the Mittelmacht, as he says, the hegemon as the central mediator in the European Union, taming and softening the rising political divergences, stimulating the modernization of European economy, and leading European security policy outside Europe. He tries to put this new German role, hegemonial role, in his view, in sharp contrast to the catastrophic German attempts of hegemony in the two worlds. The British historian Jan Kershaw also looks at Germany as in this book, which you now probably know in English, not in German, looks at Germany as the dominant player in the complex politics of the European Union. Others, such as the political scientist Angelo Bolaffi, or the American expert of Germany, William Drozdiak, take a similar view. This view is also visible in the language of many German politicians who, since about 10 years, speak of Germany as the largest and the leading country in Europe. They usually underline the cooperation with other member states in the European Union, especially with France, but France unofficially is often seen as weak in economic and administrative terms. To consider Germany as a hegemon in the European Union, however, is not the common position among German academics. Not only specialists of the European Union, but also generalists, such as the historian Heinrich August Winkler, in this book, which came out recently, refuse to take this position. The third view of the role of Germany in the European Union sees this country neither as a reluctant nor as a mediating hegemon, but as a powerful, egoist, and dangerous hegemon, a return to the position of Germany in Nazi Europe with other, not military, but economic instruments. This position is taken by the extreme left and the extreme right politicians, especially in Southern Europe, but also in other parts of Europe. But this view can also be found by some academics, such as the Greek economist Yanis Varoufakis in this book, or the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben. In the fourth view, Germany is seen not as the hegemon in Europe, but as a co-leader in the decisions of the European Union. All decisions in this view must be negotiated with other member states, especially with France, and before the Brexit, also with Britain. Initiatives often come from other member states. This co-leadership is clearly different from the role of hegemonial mediator. On the one hand, because Germany much more directly follows its own interests. On the other hand, because several countries act as mediators, not simply Germany. This role of co-leadership includes strong possibility for Europe, which is not avoided or refused, but it is far away from the hegemonial role of Germany. This view is taken by historians such as Timothy Gardner-Nash or by Konrad Jarosz in this book, in which Konrad speaks of, I cite him, joint leadership between Berlin and Brussels. It is also taken by political scientists such as Joachim Schild. Now, why is the role of Germany not hegemonial? This is first, in my view, a matter of scale. It is still true, as De Hio said 60 years ago, that Germany is too small for a hegemonial position in Europe. Only 18% of the population of the European Union are Germans after the Brexit. Before was less. The share of Germans in the European Union is far away from a demographically hegemonial position from the over 60% of Russians in the Bismarck Reich, or from the about 50% of US Americans in the NATO before the fall of the wall. This lack of hegemonial situation for Germany in the European Union is also distinct for GNP. The share of the German GNP in the GNP of the European Union was about 22% in the 2010s. This would be the share of California and New York State taken together as share of the GNP of the United States, which is no basis for a hegemony of these two states in the United States. So the demographic, economic, but also the military and cultural preconditions of a German hegemony are weak or lacking at all. The EU is still right in this respect. In addition, and this is different from Europe before World War II, the European Union is built for avoiding a predominance of a large country. Since the beginnings, the purpose of the European integration was to tame Germany, but also France, or later Britain. No dominance of a single country in the European Parliament or in the European Commission, in the European Court, or in the European Central Bank. The only institution for potential hegemonial dominance is the powerful European Council, but in the European Council, in fact, this is not the, but in fact, the European Council is not the place for unilateral hegemonial decisions, but in this council, the work is usually based on leadership and alliances. Moreover, an effective hegemonial vision is lacking in the German political elite. There are visions, to be sure, hegemonial visions, to be sure. They are either not known or failed as efficient hegemonial visions accepted by other member states. The most known German vision, the ordo-liberal concept of zero indebtedness and of cuts of public spending in case of high public debts, was not accepted by a majority of the member states of the Union and produced deep frictions in the early 2010s, very different from the hegemonial Pax Americana after the Second World War and its promises of democracy and high standard of living. Finally, and this is the argument by Brendan Sims, there is no acceptable historical model for German predominance in Europe. For French supremacy in Europe, positive historical references could be Louis XIV or Napoleon. For British supremacy, the Industrial Revolution and the 19th century economic liberalism. But for German supremacy, there is no such positive model acceptable for Germans and other Europeans. The only acceptable historical model was, with some German leadership, could be the 19th century pentarchy of Britain, France, Russia, the Habsburg Empire, and Prussia. This, however, is a model for co-leadership and not for hegemony of one single country. Now, my third part. Is the dictum by Ludwig the Hero still valid? Is the German government still in the trap that Germany is too small for hegemonial leadership, but too big not to attempt hegemony? What was the role of Germany in the six crises of the European Union, six crises which I mentioned before? I shall briefly look at each crisis. In the financial crisis between 2009 and 2012, the German government, on the one hand, was a major factor for the deep political and economic division between northern and southern member states about European financial policy. Since Germany, together with some smaller northern countries, vetoed European debts, which would have solved the difficult financial situation of southern member states. Germany demanded strong cuts for reducing the debts of the individual member countries. On the other hand, the German government participated in the gradual building of financial protection umbrellas which were developed to save the euro and the banking system. The German government did not act alone, but in cooperation, also in conflict with other member states. Germany acted as a co-leader, sometimes as a co-leader in building important institutions, the umbrellas, sometimes as co-leader in rejecting alliances, but never as a lonely hegemon. The following crisis, the Ukraine crisis since 2014, which happened, as you know, because of the Russian military interference in the east of the Ukraine, a diplomatic crisis in which the European Union was involved. This crisis was a perfect example of Franco-German leadership. The agreements were negotiated by the Ukraine, by Russia, France, and Germany, and the latter ones acting for the European Union and in agreement, more or less full agreement with the US government. The following conflict about the Greek debts in 2015 was a major conflict in the European Union and led to a deep crisis of the Greek economy. The German government continued to defend, together with other northern member states, also together with the European Central Bank, the policy of strict public budget cuts in Greece. Again, this was a case of co-leadership, even though the financial crisis and the the Greek debt crisis was the major reason why the argument of a dangerous German hegemon emerged. Sorry, I have to take some water. The fourth crisis, the refugee crisis in 2015, 2016, was very different. The German government acted alone without the agreement of other large member states in opening the borders for about 1 million refugees from the Near East. Thereafter, the German government tried to reach a common European program of distribution of the refugees and a common asylum policy in the European Union, but this attempt failed almost totally. Hence, this was clearly not an example of German hegemony, but also not an example of co-leadership. In the next crisis, the Brexit crisis, beginning in 2016 with the British referendum, the German government played a less distinct public role than in the other crises. The German government, which first preferred Britain to remain and later preferred to avoid a hard Brexit, fully supported the common line of the European Union, and like the other member states, rallied behind the chief negotiator, Michel Barnier. No German hegemonial position, perhaps an invisible sort of co-leadership. Finally, last crisis, the COVID-19 crisis was a perfect example of co-leadership in the European Union. The big recovery program with about 750 billion euro, by far the largest single program in the history of the European Union, was initiated in another size, initiated by the French and the German government, and in the longest session ever of the European Council, not cut in size and somewhat modified in the financial structure by a group of small, rich northern countries, and in the legal structure by a Polish-Hungarian coalition. So this was a co-leadership with conflicts and difficult compromises with other member states. Hence, in none of these 6 crises, the German governments had a clear hegemonial position. In the financial crisis and the Greek indebtedness crisis, Germany looked as the hegemon, since it presented and defended the most rigid financial concept among the member states, but it would have not prevented the indebtment of the European Union without the alliance with the rich northern member states, with the World Bank, and with the European Central Bank. Germany was far away from a hegemony based on unilateral decisions and the acceptance of the other member states. In the second part of the 2010s, the German co-leadership prevailed, partly because of the strong new French president, partly because of the pressure from outside, as in the Ukraine crisis or in the Brexit crisis, partly also because of the lesson drawn from the only German unilateral decision in the refugee crisis, which failed as a European project. So that the Heo trap did not prevail anymore. My conclusion, and with that conclusion I come to the end. My main three conclusions. First, the 2010s are a highly instructive decade because it shows that the German position in the European Union in crisis and under stress more clearly than in the happy 1990s. The 2010s, at least in the beginnings, looked as a German decade in the history of the European Union because of the weakness of the other large member states. At the same time, the European Union was a sort of a sick man of the world, since it was hit by more crises than any other region, and because it declined in economic terms in the global view in contrast to the United States. Second conclusion, the position of Germany in the 2010s never was hegemonial in the full political, economic, military, and cultural sense. Germany did not and could not become what the US was in the NATO and in the West. Germany was sometimes reluctant, but not a hegemon, partly because Germany was in demographic, economic, military, and cultural terms too small for a hegemony in Europe, partly because the European Union is built against the leadership of one single member state, whether this is Germany or France or Britain, partly because of the still vivid memory in and outside Germany of the total failure of the extremely bloody German attempt of hegemony in the first half of the 20th century. During the 2010s, the German role in the European Union shifted from a strong, highly controversial, but not hegemonial position of the early 2010s to a distinct co-leadership on the one hand, and only occasionally to the unilateral national decision in the refugee crisis on the other hand. The year 2016 was important in this shift with the new, more ambitious French president, with the experience of self-isolation in Germany in the refugee crisis, and with the Brexit, forcing Germany into a closer cooperation with the other 27 member states. What was at stake in the 2010s, so what was not a new German hegemony, but three other options. First, a rigid, controversial, dividing alliance with some members. Secondly, a unilateral national decision. Or thirdly, a co-leadership in the European Union. During the 1910s, co-leadership became the mostly preferred option. Third conclusion on the position of Germany in Europe in the long run. Despite some mistakes of the German government in the 2010s, the present position of Germany in Europe is the best one in the last 500 years. Germany is now neither a battle place, as in the 30 Years' War, or because of its own faults in the last part of the Second World War, nor is she a brutal military conqueror and central actor of genocide as during the Nazi regime, nor is she isolated in an imagined world of surrounding enemies, as in the late Bismarck Empire. To revise the dictum by the hero, Germany is in fact too small for hegemony in Europe, but not too small for co-leadership in Europe. And she learned from her own terrible mistakes in attempting hegemony in Europe in the first part of the 20th century, that responsible decisions, which are badly needed on Europe, are better made in cooperation and in institutions with the other European countries. The main challenge for the German government is now not how to achieve German leadership, but how the effective cooperation between the member states can be established after Brexit, how the efficiency of the European Commission can be reached in the new fields of health, of digitalization, of environmental protection, how democratic principles can be established in all member states, and how a common foreign and security policy looks like. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation and a very nuanced argument that picks up the more extreme positions and reduces them. You're bound to have there in the audience now, there are bound to be questions and so on. Please use the chat function. Katie Lindner will ask the questions based on your chat comments, and Professor Kaelble will reply, and I may add a sentence or two occasionally. So please, don't be shy and tell us whether you agree with co-leadership. Well, you're all being so quiet. I mean, if you don't ask a question, maybe I should step into the breach and ask, isn't there a German model that is not from the 19th century or earlier, but the social market economy is something that was developed, I think, in the post-war period and has been accepted in a variety of forms. That is a mixture of market competition and welfare state.
Yes, that's an interesting question. Social market economy means on the one hand, a market economy, which is on the other hand linked to a strong social state intervention. And it is true that this model was first initiated in the late 19th century in the Bismarck Empire by the social policy of Bismarck. A state intervention which was very low compared to our actual standards. Only a very small percent of the GNP was distributed, but still this was started in this period. And in this period, most European countries more or less joined this model. And in the interwar period, it was the International Labour Office which took up this model, changed it in various respects, and even reinforced it. in Europe. However, after the Second World War, new models emerged, new models of the social state emerged. This was, on the one hand, the liberal model, the British liberal model, which was developed at the end of the Second World War with a low, lean social state. And on the other hand, the Scandinavian model, which was developed in Sweden, which a much larger amount of social expenditure. So in this period, I think at the beginning of after the Second World War, the German model still was there and was discussed, but in the public debate in Europe, it was sort of put aside by the Scandinavian and the British model. So I think in the period which we are discussing now, 2010s, this German model was not so important that Germany became, for that reason, an interesting reference country in Europe. In fact, the social expenditure is higher in other countries, in France or Denmark or Austria, than in Germany in the 2010s. It was a long answer. Sorry, Conrad.
The questions are starting to pour in. Lisbeth, I'll turn it right over to you.
Okay.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you so much, Hartmut, for a wonderful lecture. Very, very, just big picture, thoughtful, bringing up a lot of issues. I'm just going to keep it brief, but in some ways connect with the question that Conrad was asking. So I'm looking for a model or something that might make both Germany and Europe, and Germany in Europe, perhaps more appealing. And I'm thinking here, I'm just having here in front of me the Financial Times, you probably picked it up, and it connects with your element in terms of Europe's lagging in innovation. And yet Audi came out, Volkswagen Audi came out a couple of days ago with very bold predictions that it anticipates itself to be the, I think, market leader, global market leader on electric sales, car sales by 2025, or actually by 2030, I shouldn't exaggerate here. And significantly, it actually anticipates in a couple of years to have its margins, its profits margins being equivalent to the margins that it had with respect to non-electric car sales. So I'm connecting this with your element of innovation, whether this is an aberrant, a deviation from a general pattern, or whether this is perhaps the beginning of a new morning for German economy, but then also, given its size, perhaps for European economy.
Thank you, Lisbeth, for your very kind question. Now it's a matter of the future, which is difficult for a historian to treat. And so may I give an answer more from the past? I think one can say that especially in the automobile industry, Germany, as other countries as France or Britain or Italy, were highly innovative in the 1950s to 1970s. And so it could be that this innovative force can be reanimated once again in Europe. That's possible. And during this period, in the 1950s and 1970s, many economic historians say that as far as the top technology is concerned, Germany was not sort of a very strong innovator. It was rather the technology which was already established, and already successful, which was taken over by the Germans and sort of put it in a and used it in a very successful way. Maybe the same is happening again, that VW learned from Tesla and saw how the electric car could be built, was stimulated by Tesla, provoked by Tesla, and so tried to imitate or tried to follow the same path. And maybe this is the German recipe, and maybe also the European recipe, not to be the top innovator, but use the technology which is tested out for economic success. Well, maybe, but this is sort of the idea for historians looking at the future. But thank you, Mariam, very much for this very interesting question. Sorry, we cannot discuss longer.
Conrad, I'll just keep going and you jump in there anytime, right? You'll just jump in? Okay.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we're all guessing on some of these things. I think in the development of green technology, I think, you know, some of the Europeans have done fairly well as well. And, you know, I'm not sure whether just the number of patents is decisive, but rather what is being done with them and what is being brought to market. And I think the social market economy has some strength by still doing a considerable amount of manufacturing, in contrast to the financial services and the software orientation of at least the United States economy.
I'm going to turn next to Alex Schultz. What steps do the EU need to take, does the EU need to take to see a more efficient style of co-leadership to address the next crises to come?
I think now the answer of a question on the future and the answer of a historian. I think that the advantage of the 2010s with lots of crises was that the European politicians and the leadership, the leading civil servants of the European Union learned to cope with crises. They survived, not only survived these 6 crises, but also learned from these 6 crises and even changed during it because of these 6 crises. So because of this process of learning from crises, one can hope that the European Union will also overcome the next crisis. So this is the only answer a historian can give, because we do not know how the next crisis will look like, whether this will be a diplomatic crisis, a war, a new pandemic, or a new economic crisis is unclear. But I think having overcome so many crises, this is a sort of a process of learning which makes resilient for the next crisis.
Our next question, I think we probably have a lot of these crystal ball questions coming up, especially with Angela Merkel's departure later this year. How much would you contribute the quote unquote German decade to the leadership of Angela Merkel directly?
That's a good question. I think, in fact, this was my argument, that the governments in other European countries were much weaker, much more in difficulties than the governments in Germany. And the fact that Angela Merkel had to treat all these crises, and she's the only person except of Viktor Orban, which was active during all these 6 crises. The fact that Angela Merkel lived through all these crises was a major advantage for Germany. If there would have been more changes of government with less experienced politicians, I'm sure that the German position would have been much weaker. I do not say that Angela Merkel in all crises did perfectly well. I think in the refugee crisis, she did something which is morally highly acceptable in welcoming the refugees, but for reasons which I do not know, she didn't try to find an agreement with the other member states, with the other large member states in this refugee policy. And I think this was a mistake. But for the rest of the crisis, she did quite well.
If I may add a sentence, I think you have made a very good case for structural moderation on the German part, but there is always an element of personality and leadership, which we saw with Gerhard Schröder already. You can have a moderate position presented more aggressively, and should Söder become the next chancellor, I would assume that this would be the same thing, and we will only know how much personality and how much structure when this actually has happened.
Absolutely.
It was mentioned that the EU GDP and German GDP had decreased in the 2010s as % of global total. Yeah. In comparison, but how has EU welfare and quality of life changed? How might this impact the EU in the future?
Now, as I said before, this was a relative number. This was the European GDP in relation to the global GDP. That doesn't mean that the GDP of the European declined in total terms, but only in relative terms it declined. Again, a question for the future. If Europe simply continues with the growth rates of the 2000s and the 2010s, it will continue to fall back compared to the United States. It's a long-term trend which is visible in the 2010s. And my prediction would be that this will continue during the next years. The growth predictions now for the United States and Europe are again different. They are much better for the United States than for Europe. So I think this is a trend which might continue.
But I think the quality of life, according to many indicators, is better in Europe, and the social inequality that you've worked on in some of your other books is much larger in the United States. So it comes at a price.
Konrad, you are perfectly right. I don't know about the quality of life, since I since long time didn't really live in the United States, and I lived there a long time ago. And you compare continuously, and you are in a better situation to make this comparison. As far as social inequality is concerned, you are perfectly right that the social inequality in terms of wealth and income is clearly less distinct in Europe than in the United States. And this has to do first with the more developed social state in Europe, with the larger social expenditure, which in some way reduce the social inequality. It has also to do with the different tax system, and also to do with the different system of income of managers, which are far higher in the United States than in many European countries. So there are different reasons for that, but I fully agree with you, Konrad, that the social inequality is less distinct in Europe. And within Europe, there are also big differences between Britain on the one hand and say Scandinavian countries or Czechia on the other hand.
Does the idea of co-leadership between some member states of the EU have the ability to apply to other member states as they too develop economically and socio-politically? For example, could a country like Turkey also be included in some concept of co-leadership if it were admitted into the EU? Another big crystal ball question.
That's an important question for the future. Especially because of the Brexit, the European Union has not only to think about co-leadership in the internal decisions, but also about co-leadership in the European area as a whole. And this will be an important question for the future relationship with Britain, and Turkey will probably profit from development, from positive development between the European Union and Britain. But for the moment, I think as long as the actual president, Turkish president, is in power, it's difficult to imagine a close co-leadership between the European Union and Turkey. But in the long run, presidents change. In the long run, I think this might be also, if there will be a good cooperation, good co-leadership, for instance, in security affairs between Britain and the European Union, this might apply also for countries such as Turkey, or maybe also apply it to countries of the Mediterranean area. No doubt.
I think the recent Sofagate situation is not helping the matters with Germany and Turkey at the moment, but we'll see how that all develops.
Yeah.
In the sense of community in Europe, is the sense of community in Europe strong enough to allow co-leadership to succeed in the next decade? So following up on what you've just talked about, the disintegration of the EU seems a goal of successful politicians in Hungary, Poland, and elsewhere, and of outside major powers. Does the co-leadership model lend itself strongly to European cohesion?
Now, I think for the moment, it looks as if for Polish politicians, that means for the actual Polish politicians in power, that co-leadership is not a very attractive model. But it might again change in Poland, and the government might change. And in fact, former Polish politicians like Tusk, they were in fact practicing a co-leadership of Poland with other large European member states. So I don't see that the actual policy of the Polish government must continue in the long run. This is so. So I think this concept could also apply one day to Poland, undoubtedly, and many people also. I hope that Poland will be included in a concept of co-leadership, because we do have, for the moment, in the European Union, a dangerous friction between the Central European countries on the one hand and the other part of the European Union. This friction is not so much economically, but mainly politically, on democratic principles, and we all hope that this friction will be reduced in the future.
Yeah, I think we can agree on this one as well, that the hope is that the current populism is a kind of, at least in Eastern Europe, is a kind of post-Soviet hangover, and that there is enough time and positive development that it may dissipate at some point. I mean, certainly as long as there are still semi-free elections, there's a possibility of changing the internal politics.
Speaking of conflict, the next question is about China. The lecture focused heavily on the German role within Europe. Does this view of German leadership hold when you think about Germany's role in guiding European policy towards external forces, particularly China's growing economic intrusion in Europe, in Italy, Greece, etc., or in Germany's role in common foreign policy more dominant, or is Germany's role in common foreign policy more dominant?
I think this is a difficult question to answer, because for the moment, the attitude towards China is changing. In the 1990s, have been mentioned by Konrad, the attitude towards China was very positive because everybody believed China would be sort of a Japan, a strong export economy, and also connected with that, a democracy. It turned out that not only this connection did not work, that China became a strong economy, but no democracy. It also turned out that China became a new empire. And for the moment, the European Union is not very sure about how to judge this development in China, sort of imperial developments in China. And it is perfectly right that on the one hand, and Germany is a thriving country, the economic links of Europe with China are very important. China is an important export market for European products. But on the other hand, we see the imperial policy elements of China, especially in Southern Europe. The Europeans are very uneasy. I mentioned this, very uneasy about these new elements of an imperial Chinese policy, which also would not see European Union as a major counterpart, but rather some individual member states which can be influenced by this imperial China policy. But for the moment, it's not clear what the European Union will do. The situation is not unclear, and the European Union will have to make a decision, probably also because the Biden administration wants to have decisions. We will see how it will very much depend also upon the relationship between the United States and the European Union.
That is a question we're all looking at quite closely, isn't it? What the transatlantic relationship will bring.
Yeah.
And also following up on Poland and Hungary, if unanimity is needed for the EU to adopt policy, how can progress even occur given the recalcitrance, that's a terrible word, in Poland and Hungary? And what does this mean for the co-leadership model? This co-leadership is really something that that you can tell is very interesting how this works. And I think also because of this is me now, but I think because we also in the United States have seen very little of that as of late. So I think it's very exciting for us to hear about your perspectives on this co-leadership model throughout the EU.
If I got the question right, the question was whether co-leadership is possible if each country has a veto power. Did I understand the question right?
Essentially, the question is also, yes, what happens with Poland and Hungary? If how does the EU work if everyone needs to be on the same page and Poland and Hungary are not? How can we get anything done?
Yeah. I think as a historian, I would say we should in the European Union, again a question about the future, we should in the European Union on the one hand be patient, because the governments which are actually in power in Poland and Hungary will not be there in 5 or 10 years, and the European Union will still be there. So we have to have a long-term perspective and not only decide in short-term questions. On the other hand, I think the European Union has to act in a decisive way. It has to make clear that it wants to have that the principle of democracy is accepted by all member states. So the European Union tried first by the European Court to make sure that these democratic principles will be followed in these two countries. It now tries to use pressure by the expenditure, by the transfers, financial transfers in these countries. This is not possible in short term because the most financial decisions are made and the conditions cannot be changed in the short run, but in the perspective of some years, there hopefully will be effects on these countries in terms of reinforcement of democratic principles by financial transfers. They are changed, the rules are changed, but the change doesn't apply immediately. It will take some years until this change applies. One has to know, one has to have experience with these new rules. They are tried, they might fail, they have to be changed. So there's a process going on in reinforcing democratic principles by financial transfers. And when this works is not clear, but I think in the long run it might work.
If you look at it from the perspective of Poland and Hungary, there's also a paradox. On the one hand, they want to maintain national independence and illiberal policies, and on the other hand, they want to maintain funding from the EU, and that is what creates leverage. I mean, if you spit people in the face, you can't expect them to smile back at you.
So
very nicely put.
This was a plea for a long-term policy, if I understood it right, by Konrad. Yeah.
We've got a great historian question coming up next. How much credit should Ludwig Erhard get for the, quote, miracle on the Rhine? Are there any other figures that should get more credit for Germany's post-war economic success? Also, in Germany today, are there any economists, policymakers that have that sort of influence on economic policy?
These are two questions. The second question, I don't see any economists who has this impact in policy, in politics. There are some economists who have an impact, but not as strong as Ludwig Erhard. No, none of these economists has the chance to become chancellor. No, definitely not. As far as the first question is concerned, I think we should not forget the comparative view of the German miracle. There was not simply a German miracle. There was also an Italian miracle. There was also a French miracle. So in this respect, I think personalities play a role, but they are not a sort of play not a dominant role in this respect, because this was a more general European, not a pan-European miracle, but it happened at least in several countries of the western part of Europe. As far as Erhard is concerned, I think his merit is to have what Konrad said, to have built up this model of the social market economy. But as far as specific decisions, for instance, the decision on the Deutschmark are concerned, there is a controversy among historians. Some historians say that the major decision for the Deutschmark have not been made by Erhard, but by Americans, parts of the American administration. So my colleague Holt Frerich is arguing in this way. So the role of Erhard probably is overestimated in some manuals. He was an important figure, but he was not really the founder of the Deutschmark in the late 1940s. He was an important figure, but he was not the only father of the economic miracle.
Thank you. Looks like we're going to have to close there. Would you like to provide a final few words, Conrad?
Well, I mean, I think I want to thank our speaker once again for his very thoughtful and nuanced presentation. I think the image of German co-leadership is something that we need to think about. It depends, of course, also upon other partners in this. But if Europe is going to go anywhere, it will work in a decentralized kind of fashion and in an integrated fashion where it brings its members together. And if this is something that at least some German politicians have learned in the last decades, then we can be somewhat more optimistic of not just having overcome past crises, but continuing to play a constructive role in the future. Thank you, Hartmut.
Thank you very much for the invitation, for the very interesting questions. And I'm glad to have talked with an American audience. And it was a great pleasure to do this, especially now, since we are in a new era of new administration, which will pave the way for an interesting future for Europe and America.
Yes. Thank you so much, Professor Kaelble. It's great to see you again. Thank you, Conrad, so much for bringing this all together, and we can't wait to see your forthcoming book, to hold it in our hands when we can all maybe see each other in person at some point. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for participating in Europe Week 2021. This is not the last event of the semester, so please stay tuned for what's upcoming next week and the week after. And everyone have a great afternoon.